In the beginning, our entire universe was contained within an infinitely dense microcosm. Then the Star Maker said, "Let there be a light." And with a bang, it exploded, and it expanded to form the vast blackness of space. And in this early universe, there was matter and there was spirit. In clouds of gas floating throughout space, there were the earliest signs of what we might identify as sentience. At first, it was the barest, simplest stirrings of sensation, but over billions of years, the forces of gravitation pushed these clouds together, and they developed into the first thinking beings to emerge in the universe: the nebulae. All of them formed light years apart from each other, but they could detect each other's presence, and they'd learn to communicate with each other through pulses of light and shifts in gravitation. To us, these conversations would have seemed inconceivably slow, but their minds operated at a different scale, and for them, this was a frenzied discourse. They had all come into existence in a universe completely empty, save for themselves. They had literally no frame of reference to interpret their experience, and so they approached life with a sense of childlike wonder. With fervent sincerity, they communicated to each other their likes and dislikes, their dreams and desires, their joys and sorrows, and they began to develop a shared spiritual vision. They believed that just as they themselves had been formed from disparate clouds of gas, it was their destiny to also merge into each other, that in becoming one, they would fulfill their ultimate divine purpose. But instead of this, the constant expansion of the cosmos drove the nebulae further and further apart. And while this happened, each of them began to disintegrate. Gravity was causing them to collapse in on themselves, and the gas which formed their bodies condensed into discrete spheres of plasma, that is to say, the first stars. One by one, the nebulae watched as their neighbors died, and they knew that their time would come as well. As I speak to you now, it is about 20 billion years since the birth of the first star, and the last nebulae are still out there, awaiting their end. As far as they know, they were created simply to die. They do not know, and given that they are rather simple creatures, they would likely never be able to comprehend that their deaths have ushered in countless diversity of new life, starting with their immediate descendants, the stars. They are a far more complex form of life than the nebulae, in both their physiological and psychological makeup. Whereas their progenitors were defined by a sort of impotent ebullience, the stars are of a far more controlled and refined character, their behavior governed by an innate sense of formal aesthetics. Nothing gives them more pleasure than to move around each other in a great galactic dance, their movements so exact and predictable that an ignorant observer would assume that they are inanimate, and their motion is solely due to gravitational pull. It will be quite some time before this assumption on the part of planetary life is revealed to be false, by which point it will have already caused quite a bit of trouble. But, assuming that they are uninterrupted, the stars continue their dance. And when the trajectory of two of them intersects, each one projects a filament towards the other, and it is in the pangs of orgiastic pleasure where these filaments meet that planets are formed. Now, a planet, of course, is merely an inanimate lump of rock, but they do provide an ideal environment for the development of organic life, for the primordial sludge to evolve into endless forms most beautiful. And if left for a long enough time, there will be species who achieve true consciousness. Intelligent life has evolved countless times throughout cosmical history. It comes in infinitely diverse forms which, nonetheless, tend to follow consistent patterns. We can begin by looking at one of the earliest known cases, at a time when the stars and planets were still relatively young, on an aqueous world located in a subgalaxy revolving around our own Milky Way. In a remarkably rare occurrence, the oceans of that world produced two separate intelligences. The first we might call the ichthyoids. They were a large species suited to the open oceans, roughly analogous to our own world's fish, albeit with a set of manipulatory tentacles more like that of a cephalopod. The second race were the arachnoids, a sort of mix between crabs and spiders who lived in shallower waters. When primitive tribes first encountered each other, they interpreted the other as a threat and sought its elimination. But this conflict turned out to be an irrational waste of resources. Each species was so physiologically dissimilar from the other that they did not compete for food or habitat. And in their psychological makeup, it turns out that they were far more alike than you might expect. In terms of their basic drives, desires, personalities, each of them was, for a lack of a better term, fundamentally human. Enterprising members of both species realized that they had far more to gain by working together. They became, over the course of generations, a symbiotic race. In adolescence, each individual was bonded to a member of the other species, and from there they became inseparable. From our perspective, there is no exact analogy to describe the relationship between symbiotes, but it might be seen as something similar to romantic love. They were soulmates. There was no such thing as an individual effort, be it in science, art, or anything else. Everything was shared between them, and together, over time, they developed an industrial civilization beneath the seas. But here, a contradiction emerged in the basis of symbiosis. Up to this point, each species had contributed roughly equally to the relationship, but in the industrial age, the arachnoids seemed unambiguously to be the more useful race. Their claws were far more useful in operating complex machinery than the ichthyoids' tentacles, and they were the only ones capable of going up into the open air to operate the combustion plants above the water's surface. Up until this point, it had been unthinkable for members of each species to live separately from each other. In fact, due to a chemical dependence that had built up over the course of their coevolution, it was biologically impossible. But in the new age, pharmaceutical drugs were developed that could mimic this effect. The arachnoids grew ever more convinced of their own superiority, and the ichthyoids became ever more distrustful. It now became common for the two species to live apart from each other, and with this separation, warfare became an inevitability. As the conflict began, the technologically superior arachnoids were well positioned to exterminate the ichthyoids. This was the plan of their generals, but there was one thing that they did not anticipate. They may have found an artificial substitute for their chemical dependence on the symbiotes, but the emotional dependence persisted. The arachnoids may have been the more technically able of the two species, but they were also far more neurotic, and in the absence of their evolutionary partners, they became emotionally unstable. They craved to regain what they had lost. No amount of hate-mongering propaganda could stop soldiers from fraternizing with each other. Defections and mutinies became endemic. As the resolve of their army collapsed, the hardline arachnoid leaders made a desperate push for victory. They unleashed weapons of mass destruction to poison the very oceans, willing to risk their own destruction so long as it meant the enemy went down with them. Only a fraction of the planet's population survived, and they determined that such a thing should never happen again. They enacted a policy of modernized symbiosis. Through every means available, drugs, hypnosis, eugenics, the dependence was strengthened. The idea of either species living apart from the other was made to be utterly unthinkable. And this project succeeded. Their civilization rose again stronger than ever. All of the wonders of science and industry were rebuilt, and then surpassed. The symbiotic race became an interplanetary civilization, expanding across their subgalaxy, and reaching such a heightened mental state that it would be difficult for any lower species to comprehend. However, this is only one example among many. The story of human life, using that term in its broadest possible definition, is not always so optimistic. I could speak of another species which rather resembled our own Homo sapiens, to the point that we might simply dub them the Other Men. The key difference is that they did not primarily sense their world through sight and hearing, but instead through taste and smell. This difference shaped a great many aspects of their society, all the way down to their systems of racial prejudice, with racial groups, of course, being defined by the taste rather than the color of their skin. The pivotal technology of their industrial era was a type of radio that, along with producing sound waves, was able to directly stimulate their gusto-olfactory organs. This could provide a vivid, intense sensation far beyond what we experience from any of our own technology. Most of its early uses were pornographic, but it quickly expanded beyond this. There emerged an ideology of radio bliss, preaching that this technology could provide all men with a life of unceasing pleasure, that all social strife could be cured with a panacea of mindless entertainment. The military and religious establishment initially saw this as a threat. They believed that the radio would make their countries weak and degenerate. But very soon, they learned to use it for their own ends. They broadcasted propaganda to whip the people into a fervor against the enemies of the nation. With radio technology, they could strike into the deepest instincts of fear and hatred, and wipe away any notions of mercy, restraint, or even self-preservation. The resulting frenzy of bloodlust set their civilization back by millennia, and they were too distracted to respond to a natural crisis. The gradual erosion of their planet's atmosphere as a result of weak gravitation, the end result being their suffocation. Another alien civilization were the Nautiloids, a race with a rather curious physiology. They could best be described as a sort of organic sailboat floating on the surface of their planet's ocean. Their species was naturally divided into two castes, masters and servants, each one with differing physical and mental capabilities. It was long assumed that these castes were immutable and determined at birth. But when scientists discovered that this was not the case, that during childhood any individual could be induced towards one morph or the other, this shook the very foundations of their social order. It sparked a cycle of revolution and reaction, and it was not until a long period of bloodshed that the backwards elements were finally purged, and the species was able to rebuild and eventually take to the stars. Less fortunate were the brute men, whose society had come to value strength, assertiveness, and material success above empathy or intelligence. The women of the species chose only brutish men as their mates, and once the technology of artificial insemination was developed, there emerged an entire class of brutish demagogues who carved out realms for themselves and fathered every child within their domain. This dysgenic trend rapidly diminished the species' intelligence, until an advancing species of rodent-like creatures emerged to hunt them to extinction. There was also the human echinoderms, who reproduced by disseminating their sperm into the air like pollen, where it could then inseminate any passerby. They lived together in tribes, where the constant perfume which surrounded them had a profound psychological effect. It created an intense feeling of community loyalty which came so naturally to them that our religious exhortation to love one's neighbor would have seemed redundant and meaningless to them. Instead, their holy men preached the duty to be true to oneself. But much like us, they often fell short of their duty. Their history is filled with the extremes of herd-mindedness, mob passion, and collectivist tyranny, until they at last broke free of it and managed to build a society on sound foundations with respect to the needs of the individual. Had their world not perished in an astronomical collision, they might have been on track to become another interplanetary civilization. Another type, even more alien to us, were the plant men. During the nighttime, they lived a typical human existence. But when day broke, they rested and photosynthesized, and during this time they entered a reflective and spiritual state. But coming into their industrial era, they determined that all unproductive time should be eliminated. A technology of artificial photosynthesis was developed so that they could be awake and active at all times. Their lives became constant work, with no rest, no reflection, no spirituality. Their scientists were correct that their bodies could endure this without any ill effects. But the people refused to endure it. There was a mass religious movement to return to the soil, to completely renounce all forms of activity, to live a life of pure, passive contemplation. Unfortunately, by this point, they had reached a level of population density which was impossible to maintain without industrial technology. There was not enough nutrients left in the soil to support them, and so they slowly died from starvation. There were also the composite beings, swarms of insectoid or avian creatures which had little intelligence on their own, but in aggregate combined to form a human mentality. We will encounter one particular instance of this type during our main case study. But in general, there is a clear pattern that emerges in the development of human life across the worlds. As civilization reaches its industrial era, there is an inevitable crisis. As technology gives the race the power to destroy itself, the primal forces of greed, hatred, and herd mentality become all the more dangerous. The only way for the species to survive is through enlightenment, through the abolition of militarism and nationalism, and the adoption of a socialistic economic system. Those who manage to reach this state will achieve what can only be described as a utopia, a society of a far higher type than our own, in both its material achievements and its spiritual state. Each individual in these societies feel that they have achieved their ultimate purpose, that they are now one with the benevolent divine who surely created the universe for their benefit. But this is not an inevitable or even a common path for a civilization to take. When given the power of industrial technology, the vast majority of them fail to adapt to it, and so they destroy themselves. In their final throes, they know nothing but death and misery, and they declare that if there is a greater force out there, if there is a Star Maker, then his name must be hate. To illustrate this principle, it is worthwhile to go over the history of a single world in more extensive detail. This is one that is not particularly remarkable in the scheme of cosmical history, but it is one that I expect most of you will find to be of special interest. This is the planet Earth. For a complete account, I ought to start with the first intelligent lineage to evolve on the planet. A sort of philosophical lemur which emerged on a prehistoric island. They had a level of practical intelligence, which is to say the ability to analyze and manipulate the world around them to their own ends, which was at a level similar to our own. But they also had a much higher level of spiritual intelligence, that is to say, the introspective ability to understand and master their own inner fears and desires. The type of mental imbalance that creates neuroticism, hatred, selfishness, and assorted psychological complexes was practically unknown to them. As a result, their civilization was incredibly peaceful, but also stagnant, remaining in a technologically primitive state. They had simply no desire to exploit the world around them, to hoard more than they needed. And so they flourished on their verdant, isolated island until a land bridge formed linking it to the mainland. And their home was invaded by a far stronger and more violent species of ape. The lemurs knew no weapon other than kindliness, whereas the apes had sharpened sticks and stones, which proved to be far more effective. Within a few generations, they had killed and devoured all of the lemurs, and it is the descendants of these primitive anthropoids that would go on to evolve into the species Homo sapiens, who may also be referred to by another term, the significance of which will eventually become apparent. The first men. We are a species with the same level of practical intelligence as the lemurs, but with a far weaker introspective ability. We're a species who is frequently vexed by our own emotions, who try to fill in the holes of our lives by seeking out material possessions that we don't need, or by asserting our dominance over others. There have been those throughout history who have managed to rise above this and attain a level of spiritual intelligence. Men like Siddhartha Gautama, Socrates, Jesus of Nazareth. But there are few who have truly understood these men's teachings, and even fewer who have managed to carry them out in practice. Far more often, their words are twisted, and used as a justification for an even greater scale of war and oppression. And in all fairness, this makes Homo sapiens fairly typical as far as human species throughout the cosmos go. It was the lemurs who were the exception rather than the rule, a species uniquely ill-equipped for this universe, who were then weeded out by natural selection. Our own test, like that of many human species, has come with the advent of the Industrial Age. We only need to look to the recent European war to see the full extent of our self-destructive capacity. There was a brief moment where it seemed possible that this calamity would be sufficient to spark a racial awakening, but any potential renaissance proved to be stillborn. All of the grand idealism of the 14 Points and the League of Nations has amounted to very little. The revolution in Russia at first seemed to offer far more hope, but it has been set back by its own reductionist materialism. The revolutionaries rejected any form of higher spirituality, and in doing so they rejected the very font of drive and imagination necessary to build a new society. Instead, they have simply recreated the old system of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality under a slightly different guise. The next potential hope might have come from Homo sapiens being succeeded by a more advanced race. I doubt that many of you are familiar with the case of John Wainwright, as the details of it have been thoroughly censored in the press. He was a genetic mutant born in Great Britain. As a toddler, his intelligence was already that of a genius. Before the age of 10, he had become a prolific inventor, and during this time he had also committed several robberies and is believed to be responsible for the murder of at least one police officer. In his adolescence, he engaged in a string of sexual liaisons with men and women alike, including with his own mother. And then, in his adulthood, he gathered a collection of similar mutants from around the world, who formed what he dubbed to be a new species, Homo superior. They settled on a Pacific island, and they made it their own after liquidating the indigenous inhabitants. But then the other Pacific powers condemned them for their communistic social order and their unconventional sexual customs. The United Kingdom, France, United States, Netherlands, Japan, and Soviet Union formed a coalition navy to destroy them. The mutants repelled the initial attacks using their telepathic mind powers, but seeing that their position was ultimately hopeless, they set loose an atomic explosion to ensure that their enemies would be annihilated along with themselves. With this last hope extinguished, it seems that the current path of our civilization must be taken to its logical conclusion. But that does not mean that it will be a straightforward journey, or that there will not be hope of rebuilding from the ruins. From here onwards, I will be speaking of events that occur in our own future. These have been made known to us through a variety of means which may be labeled as more occult than strictly scientific. Whether these events are predestined, or whether there is a chance that we, through our own actions, might forge a different future, I cannot say with any certainty. But in either case, I believe that we can only benefit by knowing where we will end up if we continue on our current trajectory. We can expect that the coming centuries will be defined by a series of increasingly destructive wars between the great powers, until by the 23rd century all of the world is divided into two spheres of influence, those of China and the United States. The war that inevitably breaks out between them is the most terrible to date. It rages for a quarter century, and during this time it seems as if the species might finally perish. But here, the two forces that have upheld the world order up to this point, nationalism and capitalism, come to the point of irreconcilable division. Business interests on both sides of the war conclude that this can only end with the destruction of all mankind, and they decide that this would not be to their profit. So they coordinate simultaneous coups to overthrow the belligerent governments and bring the entire planet under the control of a new world state, jointly governed by the syndicalist World Industrial Council and the plutocratic World Financial Directorate. Prior to the war, America and China may have been on equal footing militarily, but the United States held unquestioned cultural hegemony. There was no part of the world that did not know the American press, gramophone, radio, cinematograph, and televisor. What they saw was invariably the most vulgar aspects of the culture, the vapid decadence of New York and the religious bigotry of the Midwest. And this, naturally, engendered a low esteem for the country. In Chinese propaganda, Americans were the tapeworms of the planet, their low-grade mode of behavior starving out the higher capacities of the human race. But try as they might, people from all countries can't resist but be drawn into the American way of thinking and doing. And so, the creation of the world state inevitably gives way to a thoroughly Americanized planet. This extends to a frantic Protestant work ethic which brings rapid material advancement to the species, albeit at the expense of its spiritual life, and it also extends to even baser aspects of American culture. The old racial categories become obsolete due to extensive intermarriage over the centuries. But an exception is made for those of African descent, who have always held a particular place in the minds of white Americans. An unconscious guilt for centuries of slavery and oppression is contradictorily expressed in vehement feelings of hatred and disgust, but also in a deep psychosexual obsession. In the world state, this contradiction is ritualized. Those who are deemed to be of pure black heritage are set aside as a sacred caste. They are held to be servants of the divine, but in this they are also outcasted from mainstream society, denied the rights of citizenship, subject to gruesome rituals meant to provide catharsis to the general population. The other significant racial caste are the Jews. You see, the Americanized world state has developed its own set of taboos. Anything requiring originality rather than routine, contemplation rather than action, is spurned. Intellect is a sinful quality. But yet, a class of educated professionals is needed to maintain the functioning of society. And so, just as the Jews of medieval Europe were pressed into providing financial services from which Gentiles were barred by religious taboo, so in the world state is it the Jews who are forced into administration and other roles which require an active intelligence. This allows the Gentiles to live a life of mindless action. Material progress has reached the point that labor for most people is unnecessary, and so they are left with an unprecedented amount of leisure time. But to simply sit still is not an acceptable option. It's determined that the best way for people to spend their time is through aviation. the most advanced, the fastest moving of all sporting activities, the ideal escape from the sin of idleness. The airplane becomes a common household item, the primary mode of religious devotion, the centerpiece of all stages of life. As soon as an infant is born, it is made to grasp on the wings of its father's airplane to go for a ride. A large percentage of them are unable to hold on throughout the flight, but this is accepted as a means of preventing overpopulation. Any surviving children look forward to their adolescence, where they will be given the chance to earn their wings and be accepted as an adult. From there, flight is the ultimate joy and duty for the remainder of their lives, earning glory through ever more elaborate and dangerous stunts of aviation. This state of affairs lasts for 4,000 years, but in the world-state's ceaseless drive for material progress, it eventually reaches a shortage of resources. Petroleum reserves had been expended early in their history, and so they transitioned to a fully coal-based economy. But in time, even the vast coal fields of Antarctica became dangerously depleted. In this crisis, they turned to the divine for guidance. The official religion of the world state was the cult of Gordalpus, a syncretic mix of Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, along with findings from the field of subatomic physics, all ministered by the Sacred Order of Scientists. But despite its lofty origins, it has long since degraded into the mindless repetition of stale homilies. They declare that mankind must show sufficient religious devotion in order to bring about divine intervention. And the only way to do this is, of course, to devote ever more resources to aviation. The predictable effect of this is to only accelerate the fuel crisis. The only ones trying to stop society from breaking down are the Jews, and there is only so much they can do as the standard of living collapses and riots break out throughout the planet. The resulting civil war becomes defined by savage biological warfare. Entire cities disappear in an orgy of cannibalism, and only a tiny fraction of the world population survives, earning a meager living through subsistence farming. The resultant Dark Age lasts for 100,000 years, until a new advanced civilization emerges in the land once known as Patagonia. Harnessing wind and solar energy, they recreate the progress of their predecessors. They build a culture that has its own obsessions and anxieties, with its own weaknesses and inequalities. They make massive technological strides and even unlock the secrets of atomic energy. But this proves to be far more than what they are prepared for. During a labor uprising, a power plant is accidentally damaged, and this starts a chain nuclear reaction, forming an incandescent hurricane that sweeps across the Earth. Most of the planet is left uninhabitable, and the world population is reduced to a group of only 35 individuals living in a remote Arctic settlement. It takes millions of years for them to spread out as the Earth slowly becomes habitable again. And over this span of time, they are not exempt from the pressures of evolution. One population degenerates into a race of baboon-like subhumans, sunken to the point that they are easily enslaved and used as livestock by an advanced species of monkey. But the other group takes a different evolutionary path, and they become the Second Men. This species is the successor of Homo sapiens. Roughly speaking, they are to us as we are to a primitive anthropoid. They are taller in stature, with a much larger brain. They have shed vestigial structures like the appendix and the tonsils. Their toes have fused together, so that they walk more efficiently with each foot as a single block. Their eyes are able to perceive 2 additional primary colors. Their tissue heals at a faster rate, their teeth are immune from cavities, and their typical lifespan is around 2 centuries. The Second Men possess a high level of spiritual intelligence, not unlike that of the extinct lemurs. They are practically free of selfishness and neuroticism, and feel a great loyalty not to any tribe or nation, but to mankind as a whole. And indeed, not even for mankind as an abstraction, but a deep appreciation for each individual personality. The sexual drive, which in the first men was typically focused on members of the same species and opposite sex, becomes, in the second men, a milder but equally poignant appreciation for the flesh and spirit of all living things, man and beast and bird and plant alike. But the history of the second men is not untroubled. Early in their history, the monkeys who had enslaved their baboon-like cousins wage biological warfare against them and nearly drive them to extinction. And then, the second men prove that as enlightened as they may be, they are not immune from ideological or religious strife. But they do eventually enter an industrial age powered by wind, hydrological, and geothermal energy. And it is during this time that they face their greatest challenge as a race, an alien invasion from the planet Mars. Now, on Mars, an intelligent species has arisen, which follows the composite bow plan. They exist as a cloud made up of floating, microscopic particles which are biologically extremely simple, but which together function similarly to the neurons of an animal brain, sending signals via ethereal vibrations. The Martian cloudlets are one of the more unusual forms of human life, and as you might expect, they have a particular social structure, with a far more fluid sense of individual identity. It is possible for a single cloudlet to divide itself in order to perform separate tasks and then reconvene itself. And there may also be multiple cloudlets who have their own individual minds and their own individual personalities, but are also telepathically linked with each other into a kind of supermind. This biological feature is unfortunately detrimental to the species in the long term, resulting in an especially low level of spiritual intelligence. The Martians lack introspective ability to make sense of their own emotions and impulses, and the structure of the supermind tends to reinforce the prejudices and anxieties of its constituent members. At this moment in their history, there is only one supermind on the entire planet, having eliminated all competitors in a fit of maniacal xenophobia. And now, with a shortage of water and vegetation on their desolate planet, they use advances in theoretical physics to leave the atmosphere of Mars and ride the solar winds to launch a raid on Earth. Initially, they are unsuccessful. Given that their bodies are kept together by ethereal vibrations, they are extremely sensitive to the strong gravity and atmospheric humidity of Earth. And the second men, though they are initially bewildered by the invasion, quickly learn that the cloudlets can be dispersed through a concentrated beam of radiation. But a single failure is not enough to dissuade them, nor is a dozen failures, nor 100. The Martian supermind is simply incapable of accepting defeat or even changing its approach. They do not view mankind as conscious beings. They assume that these bipeds must be simple livestock kept by the true intelligence of Earth, which they assume must reside within the wireless transmitting systems, which are the source of the radio waves which have caused them so much trouble in their endeavors. Being trapped within metal structures, they are obviously a far lower form of life than the Martian cloud, and ought to be easily subjugated. Though paradoxically, the Martians, being a cloud-like people who can, at most, obtain a jelly-like consistency with great effort, associate rigidity with the divine, much like we terrestrials assume that the divine must be ethereal. For them, this translates into a fanatical devotion for hard crystals, especially diamonds. When they see these being worn by the second men as ornamentation, they are enraged. To use diamonds as mere decoration for cattle is sacrilegious. There are no lengths to which they will not go to liberate the diamonds of Earth. The second men are initially able to repel them with ease, but each wave becomes more and more difficult. Whenever a Martian is slain on Earth, it disperses into particles which act as viruses in the terrestrial body. After 50,000 years of war, these pollutants leave the second men physically and mentally crippled. Meanwhile, the population of Mars has been depleted, but the Supermind cannot contemplate an end to the fighting. And so, the second men, brought to their lowest point of fear, desperation, and hatred, develop a virus that will spread among the Martians and wipe out their species in its entirety, with the caveat that it will have the exact same effect on mankind. It is a testament to their degraded state that there is no debate over the desirability of this action. The virus is immediately set loose to thunderous applause. The infection quickly spreads to the Martian invaders and back to their home planet, and the species quickly becomes extinct. It also wipes out the vast majority of the terrestrial population, but here there are unexpected survivors. The invasion has taken its toll, both physical and mental, and the effect endures for generations. Mankind becomes lethargic and unambitious. They maintain enough motivation to feed themselves and reproduce, but their society becomes utterly static. This Dark Age lasts for 30 million years, and it only ends when an isolated population finds itself on an island facing climactic change. To survive, they must change and adapt. In these new conditions, the force of evolution molds them into the Third Men. They are a much diminished species of a rather feline appearance, about half the height of their predecessors, with a mentality that has returned to a state more comparable to the First Men. Various civilizations rise and fall over the course of their history, each one defined by an overarching obsession. For, if nothing else, the Third Men are distinguished by their particularly strong creative impulse. There is a holy empire of music. There is a civilization obsessed with birds, one dedicated to the concept of metabolism, and several of them revolving around sexual creativity. Each of these obsessions lasts only so long until it stagnates, until the people lose their passion and the civilization falls apart. And each time, the race is able to rebuild and start again. This cycle goes on for millions of years, up until a self-inflicted disaster from which there is no return. In one of the more technologically advanced phases, there is a civilization obsessed with eugenics, and specifically, a faction wins out that believes that the perfect human may be created by selecting for maximum intelligence at the expense of all other attributes. The changes that they envision go far beyond what can be achieved through selective breeding. They spend millennia perfecting the science of engineering the germplasm to bring about their desired being. The early experiments result in abominable things that live short and painful lives. But at last, their ultimate success. The Great Brain, with a diameter of nearly 4 meters attached to a shriveled vestigial body. This creature cannot survive under natural conditions. It must be plugged into complex machinery and attended to by a small army of dedicated servants. And as it matures, it becomes abundantly clear that the mission is a success, that it possesses a far superior intelligence to any of the Third Men. They eagerly install it as their enlightened despot, and for a time, it serves this purpose ably. The Great Brain, being created solely for its analytical intelligence, is completely devoid of empathy. But it recognizes that having a legion of devoted servants is advantageous for its interests, so it governs the Earth justly and efficiently. This task takes only a small fraction of its mental energy. The rest is dedicated to scientific experimentation, to delving into the deepest secrets of the universe, too complex for any lesser mind to comprehend, and eventually too complex for the great brain itself to make sense of alone. To carry out its research, it needs others of equal stature, so it orders the creation of more brains, who become the Fourth Men. Thousands of these brains are produced, and they become the tyrannical ruling class of Earth. They need substantial resources to sustain themselves and to carry out their experiments. The Third Men are reduced to a slave class of manual laborers to support them. This process is carried out slowly, so the Third Men are largely unaware of what is happening. But eventually it becomes impossible to ignore as rights are curtailed and the quality of life decreases. The final straw comes when the brains order that all non-economically productive animals on the planet should be exterminated. This is the greatest expression of the Fourth Men's cold inhumanity, trying to destroy all of the natural beauty left on Earth, and the Third Men break out into rebellion. Should this revolt have been unanimous, the fate of the Great Brains would be sealed. They are utterly reliant on their servants to feed them and to maintain the machinery that keeps them alive. If this is shut down, they will die instantly. But many of the Third Men are still enthralled by a mixture of fear and reverence for their masters, and they refuse to rebel. What could have been a quick coup d'etat becomes a bloody civil war, and the Great Brains put all their cunning to their advantage. They have long been experimenting with a mediumistic stock of the Third Men, highly susceptible to hypnosis. Using Martian particles, they now engineer them into unthinking automatons under their direct telepathic control. Operating with perfect synergy, this robotic slave race destroys the rebels in battle. Now that the Third Men have been rendered obsolete, all of them, even those who were loyal during the war, are liquidated. Only a small breeding population is kept alive for the purpose of experimentation. Most species of flora and fauna become extinct, and the whole planet becomes a giant laboratory for their experiments. But the tragedy of the Fourth Men is that the further they delve, the more they realize that there is a fundamental barrier in their understanding of the cosmos. In terms of pure, practical intellect, they are the undisputed superior of any prior form of man. But they lack any spiritual intelligence. They do not know the power of love, and without that, all of their efforts are hollow. There is an entire dimension of understanding the universe that is off limits to them, and this deficiency is their ultimate frustration. The only way that they can hope to gain an understanding is by creating a new race, through which they might obtain this knowledge vicariously. So, they take the remaining specimens of the Third Men, and they engineer them into the Fifth Men. This is a species designed to exceed in both practical and spiritual intelligence. Their brains are as large as possible without impeding their other physiological functions, and in order to support their massive heads, they are given a large and sturdy build standing over 4 meters tall. They feel the same range of emotions that is common to all natural forms of mankind, the same feelings of anger, fear, curiosity, humor, tenderness, egoism, sexual passion, sociality, and self-regard. Yet none of them are overwhelming. They are able to keep all of them in balance. All of this is incomprehensible to the Fourth Men. They fear losing control of their creations, and they become tyrannical. The Fifth Men rebel, and after a long and bloody war, they emerge victorious. The Earth is free from the domination of the Great Brains, and this new species takes control of their own destiny. The civilization that they build surpasses all previous ages in both its scientific knowledge and its social harmony. Labor becomes practically unnecessary, as all essential economic functions are automated. But the Fifth Men possess a relentless creative drive, and they devote themselves to expanding their knowledge and abilities. For a time, the most promising venture seems to lie in developing the telepathic abilities that the Fourth Men had given them. They even embark on a program of eugenics, which, after many failures, produces children who are able to cast their minds backwards in time and view the events of the past, to look back on the hundreds of millions of years of history preceding this point. But for this utopian society to view all the pain and misery of the past, but being unable to stop it, all becomes a source of great distress. They cannot stop themselves from engaging in this obsession. This neuroticism has the potential to undermine their very society. But then there is revealed to be a far more pressing problem. The astronomers of the Fifth Men discover that gravitational pull is bringing the moon closer and closer to Earth, and a collision is inevitable. Even with the technology at their disposal, they cannot stop this calamity. But they still have millions of years to plan, to find a new planet to settle. The first option, Mars, has been uninhabited since the extinction of the cloudlets, but it has also become a desolate planet, lacking in air or water. A far more suitable candidate is Venus. Its temperature is significantly higher than Earth's, but the polar regions are still habitable. There is a low concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, but if it is separated from the H2O and the CO2 molecules, it can become just as plentiful as Earth. And this can be achieved relatively simply by introducing vegetation and setting up electrolysis stations on the oceans which cover the planet. But when these stations start incurring inexplicable damage, the Fifth Men make a discovery. There is life beneath the waters of Venus, including an intelligent species resembling a betentacled swordfish which feeds off radioactive particles. They have built an advanced aquatic civilization powered by nuclear energy, and they resent any intrusion on their waters. Attempts to make contact with the Venerians have no success, and even if they did, the conflict seems to be intractable. To make Venus habitable for mankind will kill off the native life. The oxidation of the water will destroy their tissues. They will burn to death. But there are also no other options for the Fifth Men. They have come too far. There are no other planets where they have the time to set up a colony before the moon crashes into Earth. After careful consideration, it is decided that though the Venerians may be intelligent, there is no evidence that they have reached the same level as the Fifth Men. And in a desperate situation like this, the needs of the higher species must come first. Rather than letting the Venerians die slowly and painfully, a policy of mass euthanasia is employed. A submarine fleet is sent to humanely obliterate all native life in the oceans. The colonization of Venus now proceeds without obstacle. As predicted, the Earth is lost, but the terrestrial lineage survives. This move is difficult. The Fifth Men are a highly empathetic race, and however justified their actions may have been, they cannot help but be haunted by guilt. Their higher functions are impaired, and much of their attention is taken up by the simple struggle to survive. Although Venus might be technically habitable, its environment is still far harsher and more variable than that of Earth. The Fifth Men's spark of intelligence begins to fade, and to adapt to their environment, they evolve into manifold forms. For a time, the most successful species is a seal-like race of submen who have become fully aquatic. They hold dominion over the oceans for millions of years until another race, annoyed by their piscatorial success, harpoons them into extinction. And it is the descendants of these seal hunters who become the Sixth Men. They rebuild civilization from scratch, going from hunter-gatherers to an advanced technological society. with their progress regularly set back by war and civilizational collapse. This goes on for 200 million years, until, when they reach the height of their technological prowess, they become enamored by the science of eugenics. But here, their goal is not to maximize intelligence. They have in mind something far more specific. Their civilization is defined by a religious obsession with flight and a dark envy for the avian kingdom. They long for the freedom of the skies, and they find that not even airplanes can sate this desire. With the power of science, they remold themselves into the Seventh Men. This is a small and light species who possess a membrane of skin connecting their hands to their feet, with which they can glide through the air. When they take flight, they become totally carefree. All anxieties disappear, all sensations are heightened, and everything they perceive becomes beautiful. But as soon as they make their landing and walk on the surface of Venus, this all goes away. They become subject to all the worries, boredoms, and griefs that have afflicted all previous species of man. And so they determine to spend as little time on the ground as possible. The Seventh Men turn to a primitive, nomadic lifestyle in the skies of Venus. Generations upon generations pass. Practically all science and technology is lost, as they have no need for it. They desire nothing but to fly through the air and appreciate the beauty of the world. This lasts for 100 million years, but it is brought to a close by a nutritional deficiency caused by the exhaustion of a certain marine salt necessary for their biological development. This causes a growing number of infants to be born with birth defects, leaving them unable to fly. Initially, these defective children are euthanized, which seems to be the most merciful course of action. But as the proportion grows, it becomes obvious that a solution must be found. So it is determined that some of these flightless children must be spared, that they will live their lives out on the ground and devote themselves to scientific study, so that they may discover a cure. This pedestrian race does become skilled in science, but they develop a bitter resentment for the flying men, who expect them to labor on their behalf while enjoying a life of unthinking bliss. They abandon their quest for a cure, and instead use their scientific knowledge to rebuild industry and make themselves the masters of Venus. They continue their vendetta against the flying men by taking control of their feeding grounds, and forcing them into a life of wage labor in return for subsistence. The resulting rebellion is decimated by the pedestrians' airplane fleet. The surviving population of around 1 million flying men is deported to a remote island where it is hoped they will perish slowly. Rather than submit to this, they decide as a collective that the most noble and beautiful course of action is to take to the skies one last time, and then dive into the fires of a volcano. The pedestrians are now the sole race of Venus, and they endeavor to purge themselves of any remaining avian traits. They remold their species into the Eighth Men. They turn Venus into an engineer's paradise, an inversion of everything that the flying men had valued. The natural world is dismantled in its entirety, every inch of land utilized for industry and agriculture. The ruling class becomes so prosperous that they turn to warfare as a mode of entertainment. They typically spend a few centuries amassing as much wealth as they can, then squander it all in an orgy of destruction. This turns out to be a surprisingly sustainable system. These regular, controlled periods of destruction prevent the buildup of any tensions that could be truly cataclysmic. The cycle is only interrupted when their astronomers make a discovery. It seems that the Sun is on track to collide with a volume of non-luminous gas floating through space, and this will cause it to flare up and expand massively. The effect will be so great that the only way to survive is to flee to the other side of the asteroid belt. And specifically, the most suitable planet is determined to be Neptune. Beneath its thick atmosphere is a rocky core which may, in principle, be habitable. But both the gravity and the air pressure are far more than the Eighth Men could ever survive. They themselves would never be able to move to Neptune. It is a credit to this otherwise unenlightened race that they devote their final years to engineering a new species who will be able to live on Neptune. Even if they perish, their progeny will live on. And so is formed the Ninth Men. The first Neptunians are about half the size of the Eighth Men, but otherwise identical. This proves to be insufficient for the strong gravity and harsh conditions of Neptune. The settlements that they establish soon collapse, and the race degenerates. They diversify into a wide range of animalistic forms, filling out the planet's food web. But the sacrifice of the Eighth Men was not for nothing. The basic human stock still survives, and from it, intelligent forms are able to rise again. This occurs for the first time in the Tenth Men. This species evolves from a rabbit-like variety of subhuman, and they form a primitive civilization of wicker huts and bone tools until they are wiped out by disease. But their deaths make room for the 11th Men. This crouched tusked species also meet an untimely end. They are hunted to extinction for their ivory by the 12th Men. This is a species with a physiology analogous to that of a kangaroo. They are the first race on Neptune to invent the wheel, but their technological progress is not enough to defend themselves against the 13th Men. This stout, warlike race inflicts a reign of terror on the planet, but they eventually waste away from genetic decay, and in time they are succeeded by the 14th Men. This is the first lasting race of Neptune, and seeing that my time is limited, I won't recount their full history. But suffice to say that it follows similar patterns to what we have already gone over. Much like us, the 14th Men have many lofty ideals, and much like us, they struggle to live up to them. Their civilizations rise, fall, and then rebuild. Their potential as a species is limited, but during one particularly protracted Dark Age, favorable mutations are introduced to the population, and a new species emerges. The 15th Men. This is an enlightened race who build up an advanced world community dedicated to eliminating what they deem the 5 evils: disease, suffocating toil, senility, misunderstanding, and ill will. And inevitably, their attention turns to eugenics as a way to achieve this. But they are not concerned with mere practical intelligence at the expense of all else, nor with fancies of flight. They seek earnestly for the perfection of the human spirit, and they create the 16th Men. This is a highly advanced race in both their physical and mental attributes. They possess the ability of telepathy, they are totally without selfishness, and they have eyes on the back of their heads, granting a perfectly circular field of vision. Much like the 5th Men, the previous telepathic race of mankind, they learn to project their minds backwards in time. They discover that they are not native Neptunians, they rediscover the histories of Earth and Venus. But, also like the 5th Men, witnessing the suffering of the past creates within them a great melancholy, and this inspires them to mold themselves into an even more perfect race, the 17th Men. But as soon as these 17th men come into being, they are dissatisfied. They obsess over imperfections in their nature that lesser men would not even be able to notice, but which are, to them, intolerable. They spend their entire existence re-engineering themselves into the 18th men. There is very much that could be said about this species, but I will try to keep to just a brief profile. More so than any prior race of man, physical appearance is highly variable between individuals. There is a great diversity of skin tones, eye color, hair growth, and facial features. To us, many of the 18th men would appear to be monstrous, even bestial. They are known to take on ape-like, bear-like, ox-like, marsupial, and even elephantine forms. This does not represent any kind of degradation, but rather remarkable progress. This is a race so secure in their humanity that they do not feel the need to distinguish themselves from animals on the basis of mere physical appearance. Individuals of the 18th men are born after a gestational period equivalent to 20 terrestrial years. Their infancy lasts for a century, and they do not reach adolescence until they are 1,000 years old. At this point, they matriculate in the Land of the Young, a wild continent where they indulge in a primitive, pre-industrial lifestyle for another millennia before they re-enter adult society. The most stressful part of a young adult's life is often in romantic partnership, as they typically form a romantic conglomeration with one member from each of the species' 96 subsexes, and it is not easy to get a complete set together. The sexual intercourse of such a group can be quite extravagant, to the point that it usually occurs only once every 100 years. Outside of this, they each pursue largely separate lives. The 18th men are theoretically immortal, but individuals occasionally die via misadventure. And in this case, an intimate funeral is held among the deceased's closest friends, wherein they jointly devour the mortal remains. As for their day-to-day lives between these milestones, I'm not sure that I can concisely explain it. The types of struggles that dominate our own lives have long since been solved by them, but they are not content to sit back in leisure. Their aspirations extend ever greater to newer and stranger fields. One of these is in the science of transtemporal telepathy, which they have perfected. They are not only able to cast their minds backwards in time, but also to telepathically communicate with the people of the past. They can communicate with us, to share their knowledge, and to influence our actions. Much of the information that I have shared with you in this lecture ultimately has its origins in communications from the 18th men of Neptune 2 billion years in the future. I cannot claim to fully understand their motives. It seems that they themselves do not believe that they have the power to actually change history. No matter how they might try to interfere, it is always the same course of events that play out. Instead, it seems that they derive some enrichment from spectating on our degraded race. There is something that they believe they can learn by studying us, something that will help them become even more enlightened. Their quest for perfect knowledge goes on for 200 million years. A race such as this has made plans for contingencies of the far future, including what they will do when the sun shrinks and becomes a white dwarf. But they are caught off guard when instead it shows signs of suddenly going into nova. Even with their advanced scientific knowledge, the 18th men are ignorant of the inner life of stars, and the idea that the sun might have its own hidden motives does not occur to them. Neptune will not be safe, nor will anywhere else around the sun's orbit. Exploratory efforts are made at spaceflight beyond the solar system, But this is not a viable option. The resources that would be needed to travel all the way to another star are substantial, and the vastness of space inevitably drives any crew to madness before they can reach even a fraction of that distance. The 18th Men know that they will perish. They expend their last effort designing an artificial seed to be projected among the stars, that the race will have at least the hope of landing on a new planet and rising up again. But as the end grows nearer, as the radiation from the sun grows stronger and more erratic, as large sections of Neptune become uninhabitable, it has its effect on the 18th Men. They have risen so high, and now they learn just how far they can fall. The complex chemistry of their awakened minds begins to break down. Telepathic abilities are lost. 3 of the 96 subsexes become extinct. Atavistic instincts of envy, greed, and cruelty make their return. Initially, those affected are condemned to insane asylums. Then, when the asylums run out of space, they are euthanized. But at a certain point, they realize the derangement has reached a point that there is no one left who, by previous standards, could still be considered sane. Individuals can no longer trust each other unconditionally. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, governments and police become necessary to maintain order. Market economies once again become the primary mode of distributing resources. The most dignified response would be mass suicide, but they cannot do this until the spreading of the seed has been achieved. It becomes the species' sole reason for being. The more degraded they become, the tighter they cling to it, while also becoming less able to carry it out. They become a people barely able to provide for the needs of the present. They are plagued by wars and depression. All continues to degrade until, at last, scared, confused, and angry, the last descendants of Homo sapiens are incinerated in the fires of the sun. But in the scheme of cosmical history, the demise of mankind is only the extinction of one species of humanity. There remain others throughout the cosmos who may be genetically unrelated to us, but are spiritually, fundamentally the same. Each of them has experienced just as long and varied a history, and some of them succeed where our lineage failed, and journey across space to become an interstellar civilization. All of these are awakened worlds, utopias similar to that of the 18th Men. But I should note that this is not because there is any tendency for human societies across the universe to become utopias. The vast majority of them never manage to overcome those 5 evils: disease, suffocating toil, senility, misunderstanding, and ill will. The fact that our own descendants managed to achieve this before their demise is an extraordinary feat. Any unawakened world could never reach the interstellar scale because they would destroy themselves long before reaching that point. Indeed, this is the fate of countless of them. Most human species render themselves extinct as soon as they have the means to do so. It is clear that the Star Maker, such that he is, cares little for any of his individual creations. By the simple process of natural selection, awakened worlds are the only ones that remain. From here, it is not a straightforward process to travel from one star system to another, as the 18th Men had so tragically discovered. The earliest attempts involve dislodging a planet from its own solar system by means of subatomic explosions and hurtling it towards another star. There is much that can go wrong during this process, And so, interstellar travel remains rare, up until a process is discovered for fabricating a new material, which is of extreme rigidity and lightness, enough to build a giant artificial craft with rocket propulsion able to travel at half the speed of light. With this discovery, more and more worlds achieve interstellar flight, and they begin to make contact with each other. Inevitably, they start out on friendly terms, each one seeking to learn as much as they can from the other. But the problem is that each of these worlds has lived for generations in perfect unity. Each of them have mastered the science of telepathy. Each member of the species is linked to the others as part of a grand racial mind. They have forgotten what it is like to meet anyone different from themselves, with different values, different habits, different idiosyncrasies. And there are a portion of the worlds who become perverted by this experience. They are highly enlightened civilizations who have long since outgrown any juvenile form of self-regard or herd-mindedness. But they become convinced that their own particular mode of enlightenment is superior to the others, that it is their duty to impose their own culture on the rest of the galaxy. And if other civilizations fail to see this, then it must be imposed upon them by force. This is a form of madness to which they, even with their intelligence and wisdom far beyond what we can imagine, cannot avoid falling prey. The sane worlds far outnumber these perverts, but their resistance is nonetheless ineffectual. They have lived in peace for so long that they have lost any ability to wage war. They possess too much of a genuine respect for the individual to impose the same kind of rigid discipline practiced by the Mad Empires. And so they are dominated. The Mad Worlds sweep across the galaxy with minimal resistance, only accepting when they encounter each other, and the resulting battles decimate entire star systems. Seeing that there is no hope in taking up arms, there are some worlds who try to resist by non-violence. They surrender to the invaders, welcome them into their planet, and then, secretly and subtly, subject them to telepathic hypnosis aimed at disintegrating their communal mind and rendering them into a state of mere individuals without any telepathic connection to their fellows. From there, they become confused and disoriented, and easily overwhelmed. This strategy is at first extremely effective, but the empires quickly learn that pacifistic worlds are the most dangerous of all. They make it a policy that these worlds should be immediately exterminated before they have the opportunity to practice their wiles. But even then, there are still some among them that refuse to resist, even with the threat of certain death. Each of these worlds issues a message, roughly to the following effect. To retaliate would be to wound our communal spirit beyond cure. We choose rather to die. The theme of spirit that we have created must inevitably be broken short, whether by the ruthlessness of the invader or by our own resort to arms. It is better to be destroyed than to triumph in slaying the spirit. Such as it is, the spirit that we have achieved is fair, and it is indestructibly woven into the tissue of the cosmos. We die praising the universe in which at least such an achievement as ours can be. We die knowing that the promise of further glory outlives us in other galaxies. We die praising the Star Maker, the Star Destroyer. Every galaxy must inevitably be faced by a crisis such as this, and I cannot say with certainty how it typically ends. But in the Milky Way, there are 3 worlds who are murdered in such a way as this. Psychic reverberations of these moments are sent throughout the stars, and they are detected by the symbiotic race. It has been nearly 40 billion years since they overcame the struggles of the Ichthyoid-Arachnoid Wars. Since that time, they have been isolated in their sub-galaxy, a hidden civilization that far surpasses any other in the Milky Way. They sense as 3 peaceful worlds are murdered, and so they reach into the minds of the mad worlds, and they restore their sanity. It is not an immediate process. It spreads between bewildered individuals who suddenly see the reckless folly of all they have done. They dissent against their government, and inevitably, the empires collapse into civil war. It takes some time before the madness is fully expunged. Some of them rebuild and manage to achieve a true utopia. Others are unable to live with the guilt of their deeds. They fall into a deeper madness and degenerate into subhumans. Other times, the race commits mass suicide rather than live with what they have done. The survivors band together under the guidance of the symbiotic race, and they form themselves into the Galactic Society of Worlds. All of the species of the Milky Way galaxy united by telepathy into a single mind. I should emphasize that this does not mean the sublimation of the individual will. Each human being in each of these worlds is still their own person, with their own personality, their own wants, their own desires. They seek out their own loves and passions, but simultaneously, they are also united with all the other billions of humans on their world into a single mind with its own personality. And each of these worlds is also united into a single galactic mind. There is no hierarchy at the core of it. There is no coercion or domination, simply the voluntary association of billions and billions of individuals. They devote themselves to a quest for ever greater spiritual awakening. To this end, they begin to make contact with residents of other galaxies. And then, they coordinate plans to make physical contact, to travel from one galaxy to another. The distance is immense. No artificial craft would ever have sufficient resources to make the journey, but an ingenious system is devised where an entire star system is flung from the Milky Way to another galaxy. The sun would provide all the necessary energy for the planet's inhabitants to survive, and though the trip will take many generations, the Society of Worlds is already accustomed to operating at a very long timetable. But there is one thing they fail to consider, which is how the star in question feels about this. It has spent its life in a grand galactic dance with little attention to anything else. And suddenly, it finds itself moving away from its proper path outside of its own volition. It can't even clearly communicate this to its compatriots. As far as they know, it is simply making a mortifying faux pas. So, the star does the only thing it can do. It goes into nova, sending out fiery filaments that evaporate its surrounding planets. It is a dramatic course of action, but it works. The project is halted, and as far as the Society of Worlds is concerned, this unexpected nova is simply a freak anomaly. Until it happens again, and again, and again. Over all these billions of years, the stars have experienced the rise of interstellar human life. They have watched planets being flung from one system to another. They have watched humans devise all sorts of contraptions to harness their energy. And all of this has created a sense of disconcertion. They begin to wonder if the planets themselves were not a mistake. That perhaps the intercourse that had created them was sinful, and they had brought a plague of vermin upon themselves. The interference in the galactic dance is the final indication they need. Planeted stars across the galaxy go into nova to exterminate the vermin. To the Society of Worlds, it seems as if the apocalypse has come upon them. It is a long time before they realize that the stars are minded beings, that this slaughter is a deliberate choice, and it takes even longer to negotiate a peace. Many of the stars are intent on the total extermination of planetary life. But others argue for mercy. They see that these constant novas are exhausting their limited energy, driving them to an early death, destroying all they have cherished in a quest of blind hatred. Humanity, for their part, adopts a policy of non-resistance. They abstain from any activity that will bring stellar disruption, and in time, the stars become convinced of their goodwill. An uneasy peace is negotiated between the two forms of life, and in time, they make friendly contact with each other and unite into a true galactic utopia. A symbiotic society of stars and worlds. This accomplishment is bittersweet. By the time this union is established, the universe has already passed its prime. The stars are reaching the end of their natural lifespan, accelerated by expending their energy in their war against the planets. The expansion of the cosmos has driven the galaxies so far apart that there is no longer any thought of physical travel between them, but they still remain telepathically linked. And so, just as the material universe begins to disintegrate, it reaches its spiritual apex. All of the stars and all of the worlds in all of the galaxies unite together into one cosmical mind. They are telepathically linked to every place in the universe at every point in history. At this stage, there is only one thing that is occulted to them, one thing that they must uncover. That is, they must make contact with the force that brought them into being in the first place, the Star Maker, that which we, in our own time, call God. What happens here is something that is not possible to fully communicate in our limited language. But I will do my best to make an attempt. At first, all they can sense are vague intimations, but then they achieve the supreme moment of the cosmos. After a period of universal meditation, the communal mind emerges remade as if from a chrysalis, and for a moment it perceives a brilliant, hypercosmical light, brighter than all the suns put together. It sits at the center of a four-dimensional sphere, of which our three-dimensional cosmos is merely the surface. And it stares upon our universe in judgment. This is not the gaze of a kindly father, nor is it the gaze of an angry demiurge. Insofar as the Star Maker's priorities are comprehensible to us, they might be described as aesthetic rather than moral. He evaluates his creation with the keen eye of an artist. Our broken lives, our loves, our follies, our betrayals, our forlorn and gallant defenses. All of these he contemplates, all of these he assesses to how they contribute to the beauty of the whole. Our universe is not the first that he has created. There have been many before, most of them of a radically different character from our own. He has contemplated each one, rejoicing in the achievement, but also recognizing the flaws, and learning from them when he embarks on the next one. At the end of this process must be the mature creation, that thing of perfect beauty, which is fit to be the bride of God, to join with the Star Maker himself and be the ground and crown of all things. This perfect and absolute spirit is formed at the end of the cycle of cosmical creation, yet it is also eternal. It is the sublime that exists outside of time, and even looking upon the immature Star Maker, so too is visible the absolute spirit, that terrible and divine infinity. I do not know if I have managed to properly communicate, but it is no matter. Our universe is not fit to be the bride of God. As we try to embrace our Creator, we are blinded and seared and struck down by terrible light. The supreme moment is over. You might think that the cosmical mind would have cause for bitterness. All of the griefs and agonies that the universe has suffered over billions of years have been designed merely for the aesthetic appreciation of some alien force. All of the achievements and sacrifices have been deemed unworthy, useful merely as a reference point for future work. But it would be unreasonable to expect the Star Maker to love his creation, for we are nothing more than a tiny extension of himself. Such a thing would not be love but masturbation. Meanwhile, we, when faced with the infinite, cannot help but stand in awe. The cosmical mind does not despair at this rejection. Instead, it declares, "It is enough, and far more than enough, to be the creature of so dread and lovely a spirit, whose potency is infinite, whose nature passes the comprehension of even a minded cosmos. It is enough to have been created, to have embodied for a moment the infinite and tumultuously creative spirit. It is infinitely more than enough to have been used, to have been the rough sketch for some perfected creation." It is with a strange peace and a strange joy that the universe faces the end of its life cycle. As the resources to sustain life are slowly used up, as the cosmical mind itself is disbanded, as the last living things that remain are worm-like creatures that inhabit the corpses of dead stars, until the final triumph of entropy, when all is disintegrated and the universe is left in a state of complete physical quiescence. But for us today, all of that is very distant. Our world is such a little thing compared to the grand, hypercosmical reality. But it is our lot, and we must take it as it is. I see that I have run over time, but if I must leave you with a parting message, I do not know whether the events I have told of today are predestined, whether we can change our own destiny, but for the sake of our own souls, if nothing else, we must act as if we can, to bring about a reasonable and a joyful world, in which we all may have scope to live fully, and live in service of mankind. This will not be easy. Our oppressors will not meekly give way. We live within an outworn political and economic system about to collapse in on itself, refusing to take even the most basic steps to alleviate its injustices. In this pivotal moment, we are threatened with this slow demise through attrition, or alternatively with a quick death through the rising tide of fascism throughout the world, which as I speak grows ever more bold and ruthless, more tyrannical, more barbarian in its contempt for the life of the mind, guided by the cunning will for private mastery, fomenting for its own ends the archaic, reason-hating and vindictive passion of the tribe. It seems in the coming storm, all the dearest things must be destroyed. All private happiness, all loving, all creative work in art, science, and philosophy, all intellectual scrutiny and speculative imagination, and all creative social building, all indeed that man should normally live for, seems folly and mockery and mere self-indulgence in presence of public calamity. But if we fail to preserve them, when would they live again? How to face such an age, how to muster courage, being capable only of homely virtue, How to do this, yet preserve the mind's integrity, never to let the struggle destroy in one's own heart what one tried to serve in the world, the spirit's integrity. 2 lights for guidance. The first, our little glowing atom of community, with all that it signifies. The second, the cold light of the stars, symbol of the hypercosmical reality with its crystal ecstasy. Strange that in this light, in which even the dearest love is frostily assessed, and even the possible defeat of our half-waking world is contemplated without remission of praise, the human crisis does not lose but gains significance. Strange that it seems more, not less urgent, to play some part in this struggle, this brief effort of animalcules striving to win for their race some increase of lucidity before the ultimate darkness. But if there are any words that I should leave you with, it should be these. They were written by one of the 18th men of Neptune shortly before the end of that race. But I believe that they will still have resonance with our own time. Great are the stars, and man is of no account to them. But man is a fair spirit, whom a star conceived and a star kills. He is greater than those bright blind companies. For though in them there is incalculable potentiality, in him there is achievement, small but actual. Too soon, seemingly, he comes to his end, but when he is done, he will not be nothing, not as though he had never been, for he is eternally a beauty in the eternal form of things. Man was winged hopefully. He had in him to go further than this short flight now ending. He proposed even that he should become the flower of all things, and that he should learn to be the all-knowing, the all-admiring. Instead, he is to be destroyed. He is only a fledgling caught in a bushfire. He is very small, very simple, very little capable of insight. His knowledge of the great orb of things is but a fledgling's knowledge. His admiration is a nestling's admiration for the things kindly to his own small nature. He delights only in food and the food-announcing call. The music of the spheres passes over him, through him, and is not heard. Yet it has used him, and now it uses his destruction. Great and terrible and very beautiful is the whole, and for man the best is that the whole should use him. But does it really use him? Is the beauty of the whole really enhanced by our agony? And is the whole really beautiful? And what is beauty? Throughout all his existence, man has been striving to hear the music of the spheres, and has seemed to himself once and again to catch some phrase of it, or even a hint of the whole form of it. Yet he can never be sure that he has truly heard it, nor even that there is any such perfect music at all to be heard. Inevitably so, for if it exists, it is not for him in his littleness. But one thing is certain, man himself, at the very least, is music. A brave theme that makes music also of its vast accompaniment, its matrix of storms and stars. Man himself in his degree is eternally a beauty in the eternal form of things. It is very good to have been a man, and so we may go forward together with laughter in our hearts, and peace, thankful for the past and for our own courage, for we shall make, after all, a fair conclusion to this brief music that is man.